So we're going to start off by watching a critical affirmative from the policy debate round. This was in the final round of the SETA National Tournament in the year 2000. Fort Hays State was on the affirmative on a topic that was resolved: the United States federal government should increase federal control over Indian country in one or more of the following areas. And then there was a laundry list of those things. As you can probably imagine, there were a variety of people who responded to that topic in ways that were not about, like, the United States federal government should totally go and do some crazy stuff to the Indians again. No. And so there were a lot of people who were sort of pushing at that. And Fort Hays was one team that ran a variety of different critical affirmatives. And at SETA Nationals, they brought out one of their new ones, which I actually think is a really good sort of discussion and exploration of the critical affirmative in and of itself. And so I like to start off talking about critical affirmatives by showing this video. Try to take notes during it. One thing you'll probably discover is that it's a little difficult to take notes because there's not necessarily a whole lot of really explicit structure. Cards aren't clearly delineated from one another, but we can chat about that a little bit, as well as about what this speech was about, as we watch, or after we watch it. And as we know, the video loads slow.
Sarah Marlowe from Idaho State. John Sharp is not judging, he's just one. Judge is Josh Martin from... Don't forget the time process. All right, so without further ado, Fort Hays State University.
The history of Western thinking in the past 8 centuries has been one of replacement of ideas within a framework that has remained basically unchanged for nearly 2 millennia. Challenging this framework of interpretation means a rearrangement or manner of perceiving the world, and it involves a re-examination of the body of human knowledge and its structural reconstruction into a new format. Such a task appears to be far from the struggles of the present. It seems abstract and meaningless in the face of contemporary suffering, and it suggests that people can be made to change their repressive activity by intellectual reorientation alone. All of these questions arise, however, because of the fundamental orientation of Western peoples toward the world. We assume that we know the structure of reality and must make only certain minor adjustments to the machinery that operates in order to bring our institutions into line. Immediate suffering is thus placed in juxtaposition of abstract metaphysical conceptions of the world, and because we can see immediate suffering, we feel impelled to change conditions quickly, to relieve tensions, never coming to understand how these basic attitudes toward the life and its derivative attitude toward minority groups continues to dominate the goals and activities that appear to be designed to create reforms. Find Deloria's observations regarding reform and rethinking impel us toward a different affirmative approach. Rather than tinkering with the current system in the hopes of concocting some chimerical plan that conforms with the dominant debate worldview, we have followed such thinking and write down the different path in the hopes of being in the debate world differently. Our various affirmative approaches over the season have been met with an outpouring of indignation and anger from many of the traditional policymaking representatives. We understand their consternation, but insist that this topic demands a refusal of business as usual. Such a refusal must resist simplistic stereotypes and essentialisms while still maintain the critical potential of re-examining recurrent patterns. Importantly, please note that we believe the debate matters. It matters to those who participated, and it matters to those who only come to be contacted with intention. Debate does not determine who we are. Members never begin to explain how that happens. But debate does implicate who we might become. For example, debate can contribute to habituated ways of being in the world that help to constitute that, our understanding of that world, of that being. Debate also matters in terms about those whom we debate. No, this is not to say that what we do in debate necessarily will translate into what we do to those implicated outside the debate round. Instead, what we do to debate is what we do to those implicated by our debating. How many of us would say that telling an offensive joke does no harm to a few parties as long as they're not present? How many of us would say that casting ethical aspersions to the absent author matters not because, after all, the author is absent? Debate must continue to examine how debate practices matter. Find the glory points us in a provocative direction. Example after example could be cited, each testifying to the devastating effect of a general attitude toward the world that underlies Western approaches to human knowledge. The base of this attitude is the assumption that the world operates in certain predetermined ways, that it operates continually under certain natural laws, and that the nature of every species is homogeneous of a few real deviants. One can trace this attitude back into the Western past. Religious concepts which have since been transformed into scientific and political beliefs remain objects of belief as securely as if they had never been severed from their theological moorings. Debate need not look further than itself to recognize how securely certain beliefs about the world are held, and to notice how these assumptions sometimes predetermine the way debates transpire. Wait a minute, one might object. Debate has changed. You were down the hegemony, but this naive response fails to grapple one of the most fundamental attitudes that underlies debate's approach to human knowledge, the one seemingly immovable object in the current relentless interrogation of debate by debate is its view of affirmation. Certainly critiques, performance, activism, genealogy, and the like, and the appearance of change, even radical change, but still, debaters continue to argue in ways that reveal ingrained, frequently unshakable beliefs about affirmation. No matter how much debate pays lip service to question its fundamental assumptions, it constantly returns to a framework of interpretation that presupposes the legitimacy and necessity of a formalized treatment of the resolution, replacing one topic for the next without ever noticing the sometimes incommensurable worlds. For example, topics are regularly interpreted as calls for action, if only for a particular debate room, if only for a specific debate round. Debaters are expected to affirm the topic by acknowledging its explicit language, and this year's obvious call for the United States federal government to substantially increase federal control throughout Indian country. Obvious, that is, despite the seemingly polyvalence of, for instance, federal control that suggests government restraint and increased government management. An Indian country that traverses the globe, one of the following topic areas that traverse themselves. Given debate's recent, expansive, and inclusive notion of debate practice, affirmers are allowed to affirm the topic in many different ways, to demand by the state, to perform resistance, to endorse activism, activate the judge space, to advocate a plan without fiat, to overlay maps, expose capitalism, read narratives, to stand in solidarity against imperialism and for indigenous cultures, but above all to affirm, to respond to a topical appeal that obviously requires action, if only on the part of the debaters. This philosophical mandate, which intertwines any topical affirmation with a predetermined belief in human agency, testifies to the mere repetitiveness of a recent debate trend rather than any radical departure from the norm established over at least the last 5 decades. Debate theory has failed to keep pace with the rapid expansion of its knowledge base. This year's topic is the perfect opportunity for debate to interrogate its own jingoism. More importantly, however, this year's topic requires a confrontation with that provinciality. Failure to do so once again forces a devastating knowledge regime on those about whom we debate. Acquiescence to a nostalgia that harkens back to the days when debate unwittingly committed argumentative and discursive atrocities against others, consents to a violent chauvinism in the name of some bygone glory. When debate accepts the unproblematic of its forebears to participate in debate as if nothing had changed, debate becomes an apology for further colonizations of those it purports to represent. Debate tells another offensive joke. What then should we do? The debate traditionalists ask, confirming yet again those inculcated beliefs about the world that predetermined frame accounts as acceptable argument and affirmation. Once again, divine DeLorean suggests another path. We see that the proper question we should have asked with respect to housing did not concern housing at all, but covered the more general question of the nature of the community. We discovered that the college application, the bilingual program, should have been transcended by questions concerning the nature of knowledge, how it is transmitted, and how it can be expanded, rather than how specific predetermined course of action can be implemented. Once we reject the absolute nature of Western conceptions of problems, we are able to see different types of questions inherent in our immediate problem areas. The immediacy we feel when observing conditions under which people live should enable us to raise new issues that contain within themselves new ways of conceiving solutions. Accepting debate's ale and affirming the topic as a problem to be solved asks the wrong question and invites the same answers. Merely accommodating this topic, like all topics, the debate's fundamental framework operates within an ethnocidal logic that silences perspective hostile to debate's traditional mission of making sure the trains run on time. Extraordinary differences exist between debate's resolute beliefs about the world and the richly diverse knowledge bases about those we debate. Uniform continuous time, inductive and deductive reasoning, planetary production of knowledge, ontology, the subject-object dichotomy, and a litany of other beliefs dramatically differentiate the people of Eternal Island as well as the rest of the world. Confronting this year's topic involves more than seeking after the missing element in today's society critical for indigenous survival. Affirming this topic must establish a different relationship with those about whom we debate. DeLorean recognizes the visionary possibilities violently excluded by dominant ways of viewing the world. Until fundamental questions regarding the assumptions that form the basis for Western civilization are raised, and new articulations of reality are discovered, the impulse to grab quickly and apparently easy answers will continue. Social conditions will continue to be described in a cause-and-effect logic that has dominated Western thinking for its entire intellectual lifetime. Programs will be designed that fail to account for the change in conditions that occur continuously in human society. Ideas will continue to dominate our concerns, and visions will not come. How will these questions be raised? Articulations discovered? Debate cannot rethink all of Western civilization, the skeptic decries. No, we cannot rethink all of Western thinking during a debate round, nor can we suspend all judgment until such rethinking occurs. Instead, debate's current speed of reflexivity must include an examination of the everyday. It must attend to the way it worlds and the worlds of others emerge. Concentrate specifically on how steers topic trends versus common space, to solve the subject-object, and render suspect standard forms of proof and evidence. How the apparent transformation happening in debate frequently fails to rearrange its manner of perceiving the world. This reflexivity must re-examine the body of human knowledge as it relates to hegemonic Western epistemic practice brought to bear continuously, whenever and wherever debate confronts this and any other topic. Debate about so-called federal control through our Indian country exceeds this time, this space. Columbus, Sheridan, Bentray, Wake Forest, airport lounges, and the bison. The bison. Any germane topical affirmation must rebuke debate's narrow disciplinary, must engage the topic's diverse beliefs, re-examine and rearrange fundamental conceptions such as agency, dissent, language, reality, policy, argument, and the like. Affirm this topic in its everydayness, as transversal dissent, temporally and spatially. Affirm this topic as a vision. Repudiate the easy solutions so often offered by debate. Resist violent and nostalgic impulses and embrace the possibility of another world vision every day.
Alright, your Lord Evidence talks about creating.
Alright. So, what are some of the arguments that are being made by this 1AC?
Well,
Yeah.
initially,
Okay, well, he's arguing that with all the project debates and cases that have been going on, like, they're just, like, pretending to, like, you know, just giving lip service to all of these structures, and so therefore he should have the right to be able to, like, undermine all of those things and look at what's even below that.
Okay.
I was gonna say, like, one of the initial arguments he makes off the bat is that we need to examine why debate is important, especially in round and the discursive choices we make, kind of like orientating ourselves to a topic.
Okay.
One thing about that comment is I think he's more trying to, he's like aligning himself with those folks that are running those types of arguments, but saying that it's always only happening on one side of the debate, and we need to embrace that perspective and rethink the way we see affirmative.
Yeah, I mean, one thing to keep in mind about this video, right, is this video is happening in the year 2000, which is before a lot of the stuff that we might think of as, like, everyday, right? Like, Louisville running race projects in policy debate was still a couple years off at this point. I think, like, 2001 or 2002 was the first time they really rolled out with their race and debate project. And then, yeah, so a lot of the teams that are doing things that are, like, reflexively, oh yeah, we see that all the time now, weren't really happening at this point. Like, the most that people were doing were like, oh, we'll talk about some maps and stuff like that. And so it was pretty straight up critical debate and primarily on the negative. And so that's one of the things that this video is sort of interacting with, is arguing that there should be more of these critical affirmatives that sort of reinterrogate a variety of things. What other arguments are going on in this 1AC? Yeah.
What about Western thought, instruction, reality, and like questioning the rules of just knowledge, eliminating knowledge?
Yeah, I think that's one of the big things that it's talking about, right? Did anyone catch how Fort Hayes in this round is discussing the concept of affirmation? Did people watch the video? Just like, I have no idea what this dude is doing. This is so weird. What's with his hair? Like, okay.
They call affirmation a philosophical mandate, and how they have to interact with it, and different ways to look at it, and how trade theory has failed to keep up.
Exactly. So what is the process of affirmation that they describe in here? And if you're like, I have no idea what that dude said, like at any point, you can just tell me that, and I'll stop dragging out the answers, but yeah.
Talked about everydayness.
Everydayness, yeah. So right, the process that he's describing in this is how you probably do affirmation a lot of the time, right? You get a topic and you're like, what are the harms areas of this? How will the federal government solve for these particular harms areas? Maybe I should find some people who have written about that, right? And so it's a process of research, construction of harms areas, discovery of a regular topical plan, and then a return to sort of write all of that together, right? How many of you feel like that's what you do when you compose your PMCs? It's pretty standard. I mean, Yeah, I watched that and I'm like, yeah, I remember doing that when I was in high school for policy debate and in high school for LD. And then I pretty much did that when I was in college for Parlay. Yeah, that's how you do affirmatives, right? And what Fort Hayes suggests in particular in this speech is that one thing that we might be able to do is to look at topics and ask questions about them from a different perspective. Look at the people who are implicated by the topic area, not as like folks we need to save necessarily, but as people who are informing the knowledge base that we're using to have that discussion in the first place, right? And so in this round, for instance, they're talking about Vine Deloria Jr., who is, I used to know this. I can't remember what specific tribe that Vine Deloria Jr. is a part of, but he is a indigenous thinker, writes a lot of articles, and they use his conceptions about the world in order to make arguments about this topic that is ostensibly discussing Indian country, right? In order to say that maybe instead of talking about the resolution or the people who are implicated by the resolution as those that we must control and be in charge of and like solve for with our mythical plans, that we might want to break out and allow them to inform some of the thinking that we're doing. And so they're asking for a different kind of research or approach to topics, right? And I think that is largely what's going on with critical, what is the best way to approach these critical affirmatives. So one thing that this lecture is about that maybe is not sort of true, that you're not expecting, is that I'm not really going to be talking about like, very much about like NAU or Lewis and Clark style projects from the NPTE last year that are like, yeah, we need to critique debate and change it for more inclusive ends. I'm mostly going to be talking about affirmatives that draw on the topic in order to inform how you investigate the rest of the world, right? I think that one of the cool things about critical affirmatives and critical arguments in general is that they open up a really unique way to look at a topic area, right? I am strongly of the opinion that criticisms are not like, they can be generic arguments in the same way that politics is a generic argument or any of these things. I said this yesterday, I'm certain some of you heard that. But right, if you're doing this in the best way, the strongest way possible, what your critical argument is going to be informed by the subject matter that you're supposed to be debating. You're going to be having a discussion about the topic in the same way that you would in a variety of other rounds. Sometimes even more so because you don't just get to like tack on that hedge advantage, number 2. So, yeah. To start off with, I think that one thing that's good to talk about is the critical perspective, because the critical perspective generally underlines how a lot of this takes place and how you come up with these ideas, right? And when I say the critical perspective, there's a lot of different things that might be that might be. But what I mean at base is questioning everything, not really relying on automatic assumptions about the world or allowing doxa to control how you're looking at different questions. And by doxa, I mean like common popular opinion sort of that's spread throughout society, right? And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to ask questions about a whole bunch. And this is going to come from both the right and the left of the political spectrum, and sometimes you'll start to find that delicious gooey place where the right becomes the left and the left's getting all up in the right's business, and it's like, what? I thought these were different things. Not really, whatever. Right? And so it's questioning all of these assumptions and trying to figure out how they operate. One way I like to sort of conceptualize that is along the lines of a pretty traditional critical argument that you hear a lot in debate, and that is the critique of terror talk. And I've got a great little video that I really enjoy that I think does it pretty well.
Well, our story begins, with old St. Augustine. Way back in days of old, he reported on this theme. A mighty emperor had got himself a pirate who was terrorizing people who were sailing on the open seas.
What meanest thou by keeping hostile possession of the sea? What meanest thou by seizing the whole earth? Because I do with a petty ship, I'm called a robber. What's thou, who does the same with a great fleet, art styled emperor?
And old St. Augustine thought that was a pretty smart answer, 'cause there are pirates and emperors, but they're really the same thing. try to reach the same ends by using the same means. Whether do it big or they do it small, from a little tiny voter from the hallowed halls. Bully is as bully does, that's plain to see. Speaking of bullies, what would you say about a gang of vicious, low-down thugs who are trying to overthrow the government by attacking undefended civilian targets like schools, farms, hospitals, and outreach centers?
Why, I'd say they were terrorists.
I'm sorry, the correct answer is freedom fighters. At least that's what you called these thugs, aka the Contras, when you funded their campaign of terror and indiscriminate killing to overthrow the government of Nicaragua. There was trouble in the land of Nicaragua in the 80s, it's true. And Uncle Sam has always said this kind of thing just really won't do. So he paid for a bag full of dirty tricks and turned killers into heroes with a PR blitz. Well, freedom's sure a funny word for what the Contras did do. You know, there are pirates and emperors, but they're really the same thing. Even the ones who say they just wanna let freedom ring. Well, they do it big or they do it small, but only one goes down when they break the law. While the big one claims
This really don't apply to me.
the funny thing about pirates and emperors is that they often start out as pals who get into a tiff somehow and end up enemies.
You mean like Lex Luthor and Superman?
Yeah, except Lex Luthor was a nice guy before he lost all his hair, whereas Manuel Noriega, Saddam Hussein, and Osama bin Laden were all known thugs and mass murderers when they were on the CIA payroll. That's why they got the job. Either that, or Uncle Sam is just a really bad judge of character.
I don't understand why this keeps happening to me.
Well, not so long ago we thought Saddam here was a pretty swell guy. And we helped him get the goods to make the Ayatollah Khomeini cry. But Uncle Sam decided it was not Saddam's fate to be the leader of his Middle Eastern client state that was sitting on top of a big, huge oil supply. Big and little thugs got thuggery coming, even if one's got stars and stripes on him. Bully is as bully does, that's plain to see. 'Cause if it looks like a duck and acts like a duck and quacks like a duck, it probably is a duck. You know, a rose is a rose no matter how much it stinks.
I resent that comment. I'm not a duck. I'm an anti-duck. I'm a counter-duck. Well, more of a mallard, really. Why, I'm fighting a war on ducks. Any ducks come around here, I'm gonna blast them.
So one of the things that I particularly like about that video is that I think it does a good job highlighting the importance of perspective and the way that the world shifts pretty radically when you talk about perspective, right? So if I say September 11th, what do you all think of? Terrorism, right? September 11th, 2001, probably one of the most intense events that the United States has gone through in a very long time, sort of changed the geopolitical landscape, right? We're all really familiar with what happened that day, right? Does anyone have no idea what happened on September 11th, 2001? What about September 11th, 1973? Does anyone know what happened on September 11th, 1973? Alright, so we got one person, awesome, excellent. Right, on September 11th, 1973, after about the third or fourth attempt to depose the democratically elected leader of Chile, Salvador Allende, General Augustus Pinochet was successful at bombing the presidential palace using planes in Santiago, Chile in the morning of September 11th, 1973, and then entered into the presidential palace and secured control of the country for himself. At which point, largely funded by the United States federal government and group of people who had all been trying to isolate economically Chile for several years, instituted a regime of massive economic transformation and brutality. Pinochet was real good at disappearing people. The court system really didn't do very much about it, et cetera, et cetera. It passes through a pretty dark time in the Southern Cone generally, where the United States and other free market groups basically imposed at the point of a gun a variety of free market capitalist reforms. Go capitalism. And it's a pretty interesting deal. If you're interested in it, right, Naomi Klein does a really good job in the shock doctrine sort of chronicling a lot of this, right? But one thing that I think that's particularly interesting about that, right, is that if we say September 11th, 2001, we can immediately identify what's going on there. Because from our perspective as American citizens and folks who live in the United States, and even folks who are sort of a little more internationally located, that date had a lot of importance. September 11th, 1973 had a crap ton of importance to a bunch of people, but not the same sort of geopolitical importance. I mean, this is one of the observations that Ariel Dorfman, who's a Chilean who was a Chilean in exile during the Pinochet regime, made right after September 11th, 2001. He looked at a lot of interesting ways that the two events were very similar to one another, and talked about how it was interesting that one of them was going to be enshrined in people's memory, and the other was going to continue to sort of fade away, as these things do when we don't actively work to talk about them, right? And this is largely the issue of perspective. Depending on where you are and what types of things are important to you, particular types of concerns are going to become immediately salient, or it's going to be like, meh, you know, something else. Let's deal with that, right? And so I think that a lot of the critical perspective is about learning how to take these different types of perspectives and apply them to topics, right? So up here I have like a group of critical lenses that all yield different results depending on what you choose to focus on or emphasize when you're thinking about things, right? Like, queer theory is going to see the world and encourage you to think about problems and issues in a different way than critical race theory is going to encourage you to look at the world or see the world. In a different way than post-colonial theory is going to encourage you to look at or see the world. In a different way than a theory that emphasizes first people is going to get you to look at or see the world, right? Depending on what perspective you select, you're going to have a radically different opinion about, you have a radically different opinion about the questions that are being asked by the resolution. That generally makes sense? Yeah. I mean, it's largely in what these things choose to emphasize, right? Like, critical race theory is going to tell us that racism is a natural feature, that we have to do things to confront racism, and that a lot of the policies that we impose to confront racism are going to be based on some sort of concept of interest convergence, right? And so the types of questions, the types of things you would be looking at, in particular, are ways that your topic becomes racialized. So you might be talking about a variety of different problems that are going on in terms of how this topic supports or props up institutional racism or structural sort of systems of racism. At the same time, right, queer theory would tell you to attend to the ways that sexuality or different genders are operating in that in that place of the resolution. And so, all of a sudden, instead of asking questions about about racialization of the resolution, you would be asking questions about how the resolution is sexualized or involves these issues of sexual and gender difference, right? You're going to get a different perspective. An example of this was this summer I was working on writing cases for high school LD, right? And one of the high school LD topics that is offered is that adolescents should be able to make autonomous medical choices, basically, right? It's a pretty straightforward resolution. It asks a lot of questions that are relevant in contemporary adolescent medical theory, right? They're talking about at what age do you have the ability to make choices about your body. And one of the things that I immediately thought of in terms of this resolution, right, is the question of what happens to intersex children, children who are born with ambiguous genitalia, and in the status quo right now, right, and this happens more often than most people think about because of this next process that happens. But when children are born with ambiguous genitalia, the doctors generally encourage their parents to immediately make their genitalia gender conforming. And so gender nonconforming genitalia is corrected surgically pretty much at birth in United States society, right? And so a question of allowing adolescents to make autonomous medical choices might be about saying that we should not take away those choices from them when they are born and allow them to make an autonomous medical choice once they reach adolescence, right? That is a critical perspective that would arise out of queer theory to a certain extent. That makes sense? Cool. So yeah, there are issues of perspective. The next thing I think is important to think about when we're talking about critical theories are issues of positionality. And largely, these issues are all wrapped up in the identity politics game, which you may think is awesome and you may think is terrible. It sort of goes back and forth. I generally think it's a good idea to have done some work on your own identity politics before you're doing this, right? Like, as terrible as it is a lot of the times, I think that it's a good idea for people to come up with a sentence that sort of describes their identity, right? That encapsulates identities that you think are particularly important or salient or politically relevant, so you have the ability to talk about that, right? Like for instance, if I was to, when I do this, my sentence usually looks something like, Kyle Cheesewright is a white, temporarily able-bodied, gay, male and masculine ascribed, genderqueer academic of fairly fluid class status. That's my sentence, right? And in there, I've packed in every identity category I find important for me to explore in a variety of different senses. So, from that sentence, right, I can start to think about what types of investments are going to come along with my perspectives, right? So for me, one of the things, like, my investment in critical race theory in particular is based mostly on my belief that race is a really important issue, that we need to investigate that, and it comes from the perspective of someone who is raised white, who is white, and has seen the world through that lens. And I mean, comes with a huge number of investments, and so that's a particular type of investment, right? On the other hand, I have a variety of investments in terms of gender and sexuality that are formed through identities that would be in-group identities, right? The idea of homosexuality or gayness, genderqueer sort of activism, right? All of these types of issues are going to be involved in in-group identifications that I make. And so those are I'm going to have different types of beliefs about those. I'm going to be automatically drawn to certain perspectives and and sort of neglect other perspectives, and that means that I have to be aware of all of these identity categories so that I can confront my biases, right? One thing that I think you'll start to discover as you get older is that this notion of unbiased is like one of the biggest pieces of bullshit that we get fostered on ourselves. There's no such thing as a lack of bias. There is such thing as being able to identify the bias that something is coming from and account for that bias. You're not going to escape bias through any activity that you can possibly imagine. It's all going to be biased. The question is whether or not you recognize where that bias is coming from and how it operates. And I mean, we could talk about this in any realm, right? There are a variety of people who write in the philosophy of science that talk about particularly how some of the most quantitative, specifically unbiased activities that we can think of, like scientific examination, are actually highly biased and very specifically tied into concepts of cultural location and identity politics. It's pretty crazy stuff. There's a lot of it there. So, yeah. This is, a lot of the time, more of a background sort of deal, right? You want to do that work before you run at these positions so that you can think through types of things that people might say, right? Because depending on your positionality, there are going to be things that you can and can't say. And I think, right, the policy world right now plays on that really heavily. For instance, the team that was in finals of SENA Nationals last year, amazing 1AC that they have. It's primarily, it's primarily rap. It's online. It's pretty cool. There's a part in the middle where they sort of break down what they're talking about in particularly, right? But I, from my own perspective and my political commitments, don't feel comfortable even saying their plan text. Like their advocacy text involves the N-word or an iteration of the N-word, which is not something that I feel comfortable saying in any in pretty much any context. And that's based on my own political commitments, right? And in those types of situations, things start to get a little sticky. And if you haven't done some thinking about your positionality, it's going to be hard to figure out how to approach those types of discussions, right? And people are always going to be able to be like, well, of course you'd say that. Oh no, what did I do? Cool. All right. Lastly, I think an important investigation that accompanies critical perspectives and building critical 1ACs is remembering to investigate the concept of power. And power at its basic is the ability to act upon and influence others. I generally follow Foucault in the observation that power is neither good nor bad. It's just sort of there. I think this is a place where a lot of people, and it's one of the harder places to actualize in a lot of senses, but power is not necessarily doing good or bad things, it is just doing things, and it's something that's going to exist, so we have to sort of figure out how to encounter it. And it also often has unpredictable effects, right? So things that we would think are obviously terrible might be producing some pretty interesting resistances if you look at it from alternative perspectives and start to value those types of discussions, right? So, for instance, I mean, the way that Foucault talked about this is in terms of Victorian standards of sexuality, the repressive hypothesis. And Foucault's basic argument is that everyone says that Victorians were like crazy repressive and doing all this terrible stuff, but what happened as a result of all of that repression was a serious naming of a variety of identities, which meant that sexual deviancy and the ability for people to engage in a variety of different sexual acts actually multiplied radically. And so, while we thought that power was acting, while it was thought that power was acting in a repressive sort of limiting way, what was actually happening as a result of that was a proliferation of possibilities for folks. It's crazy, and it's there, and we need to be aware of it because it plays out in a variety of different places. And the video that we do not have time for, because these lectures are real short, is this nice auto-tuning of the Republican primary debates last year, where, like, legit, the Republicans thought it was an appropriate remedy for students at schools to require students to work as janitors, because it would be cheaper for the schools, it would be like a really good learning experience for the students, because school's not hard enough unless you have to stay there until 10 cleaning the halls. That's largely a question of who's got power, the types of perspectives that they bring to that topic, and their inability to recognize that their positionality as, like, crazy white Republicans does not mean they know everything about how the rest of the world works.
And now we will hear it.
And it's got Vermin Supreme, who's amazing. I don't know if you know him. He wears a boot on his head, he's fantastic. So let's talk about some typologies for 1ACs. Generally speaking, when we're talking about critical 1ACs, I think that critical 1ACs that you run are largely either going to be methodological or ethical, and entail some sort of different, a methodological approach to the resolution or an ethical approach. These aren't questions about how one approaches the debate, the type of perspective that you bring to the resolution. And it will offer options of how to conceptualize knowledge and what starting points you should use. So 2 examples. A variety of years ago at SIU, I worked with a team who wrote a position that we called queer methodology. And in this position, what we largely argued was that language is not a stable thing. There are political investments in the way that language gets created, and the way that we approached the resolution was through what we called a queer methodology, which involved 3 steps. First, you would denaturalize static understandings of language. Secondly, you would sexualize the topic. And thirdly, you would bring queer identity into the topic, right? And so each round, what we would do, we wrote this huge argument, and each round what we would do, we would take the resolution and we would figure out different ways we could interpret the words that were in the resolution, and then write plan texts which were radically unpredictable, but largely based on some sort of alternative interpretation of the words that were present in the topic. Generally speaking, we would offer up 3 different plan texts that involved, in particular, each one of the pieces of what we were calling a queer methodology, right? So this whole argument was about how you approached the resolution. Instead of collecting research on the specific content of the resolution, we would look at the words of the resolution and figure out how we could play around with those and change them, right? That's what I would identify as a methodological approach to the resolution. It's about the method that you use when you get a resolution, how you respond to those questions, and why you might respond to those questions in different ways. Another example, a few years ago, much more recently, because it was actually Josh Rivera's freshman year, there was a topic at the NPTE that was about the continent of Africa, and a variety of different ways that we might be able to intervene or change things on the continent of Africa. And so one of the affirmatives that we decided to write at SIU was an affirmative that we called grief, basically. And what that affirmative argued was that instead of approaching resolutions as calls to action, we should approach them as opportunities to engage with the history of colonialism in Africa and sort of be horrified at the way that the problem area of the resolution was initially created through these colonial mechanisms, right? And so the research that happens there is about what colonial mechanisms impacted the particular countries that are being talked about in this resolution. What types of procedures created the situations that might have brought these conditions about, right? Like, so you're talking about issues of clean water in North Africa, right? You're going to have a variety of colonial mechanisms that meant that clean water is not available or existent there. Those are going to be both traditional colonial mechanisms, i.e. the way that territory was divided and given to people in that country, as well as neo-colonial mechanisms wrapped up in who owns the water in that country and these types of issues, right? And so this is more of an ethical approach to a resolution that says, from an ethical perspective, this resolution asks us to take an alternate perspective. So you defend the resolution not in a traditional sense, but in the sense that it opens up an opportunity to learn about things that we would probably not otherwise learn about, right? And this is one of the ways that these affirmatives also conceptualize approaching questions of framework, these types of things, right? Because this is the most predictable opposition strategy against a lot of these questions. And that is that you have to understand why you might want to take a different approach and what the shortfalls of a traditional approach to that topic might be, right? So when we're talking about approaching resolutions dealing with the continent of Africa as opportunities for us to explore a variety of colonial procedures that created a whole bunch of terribleness throughout the continent, that is saying that traditional policy traditional policy explorations only participate in this history of colonialism, right? And so in that sense then you get to characterize policymaking education as on-the-ground training in colonialism, where you ignore the things that you've done in the past and try to produce new solutions to the same problems and make situations worse most of the time, right? So that is an alternate way of sort of conceptualizing that topic, and it also provides a reason why we might not want to approach that topic through the traditional routes that debate has offered us, or that we learn first when we start out in debate rounds. Does that make sense? Cool. Let's skip through that. If you want to see an amazing video that juxtaposes the documentary Big Sugar with the entry song to Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, talk to me after the lecture. It is fantastic. Alright, let's talk about structure a little bit since we're running out of time, right? If we talk about traditional components of critical debate, what we're talking about is the framework, the links, the impacts, and the alternative. And one thing that I like to be really explicit about is that when I talk about frameworks, I both mean the way that framework operates in regular vernacular, right? i.e., is this policy making or something else? But more importantly than any of that, I think, are the basic assumptions that one needs to bring to a particular critical perspective in order to make that critical perspective make any sense, right? There are going to be a variety of assumptions that are not traditional or doxaistic assumptions that come along with critical interrogations. And I think that framework should be doing most of that work for you, right? A lot of people conceptualize this as a thesis page, I guess. I think that it's, I think it's part of framework, but those are linguistic choices, right? When you're writing a criticism on the affirmative, I think there are a huge number of ways that you can approach this, and you do not have to approach it in any type of routinized way. A lot of the fun about critical affirmatives and critical arguments in general is that it's like jumping into a sandbox and playing around, and you get to sort of create your own sandcastles and knock them down as you will, and it's hard. I mean, a lot of people will tell you what you have to do. They're usually wrong. It's about trying to make good arguments, full arguments, and that's really the only requirement there. But in terms of thinking through it, if you want just a basic framework to play around with, this is how I would suggest doing it. Observation 1 is resolutional analysis. And what resolutional analysis offers you is what you would traditionally consider as both links and framework arguments, right? This is where I would talk about basic assumptions in particular. And by links, I don't mean things that the resolution does that are bad, or things that the other team does that are bad. I mean the way you are approaching the resolution that allows you to conceptualize the world in a new and different way, right? I really encourage critical affirmatives to be topical. Not in a traditional sense of topicality that operates under the most limited definition, but certainly a relational and pretty central exploration of the questions that are being asked by that resolution. I think the best critical affirmatives are going to be ones that involve that type of work, doing the topic-specific research for that. I also think that that is where you offer up these basic assumptions that you need in order to understand the criticism, right? And that's all observation 1. Then in observation 2, you move on to discuss what you might conceptualize as the inherency and harms. And by this, I mean some of the framework and impact arguments that that you would offer up in the criticism, right? This is more of like the who we are, why we're doing what we're doing, so the traditional pieces of the framework arguments, and the impact claims, right? You've explained what the resolution allows you to do. Now you need to talk about the problems of not doing the resolution, which in this sense would be the impacts to your criticism. Then you offer your, I said plan, advocacy is probably a better word. A lot of the time when I work on critical affirmatives with my teams, our advocacy statement is literally the resolution. We just insert the resolution, maybe a word or two before to contextualize it, and almost every time, after reading the advocacy of the resolution, there will be an explanation of how this is going to be understood, right? Which usually involves something like, we're not defending the instrumental implementation of plan through fiat, we're discussing these ideas. That doesn't mean you're not responsible to defend anything. And in fact, if you want to effectively answer any type of T arguments, you're going to have a conceptualization of what the other team could say against you in order to beat you. I just generally think that that's a good strategy. Then observation 3, you offer up your solvency/alternative, right? That's where you discuss why the advocacy you're offering is going to be a good thing. And then observation 4, I generally talk about in terms of like ethics and future arguments. And this is a good place to talk about advantage-like things, right? Ways that you might be able to reconceptualize the world. You can put spikes to stuff in here, it's very nice. 50 minutes is really not very long. We're pretty much at the end. We've got like 2 minutes if you want to ask any specific questions. Otherwise, you're free to go, and then you can talk to me about this stuff at any point in time. I'm always happy. I love talking about critical affirmatives because, personally, I'm an affirmative person, and I just like the affirmative side better, and if I get to be affirmative, I'm happy about it. And critical affirmatives are just so much fun. You get to do whatever you want.